Okay, so today we're diving into a case that I think has really stayed with a lot of people.
Yeah.
The murder of Vanessa Guillen.
It's a tough one.
Yeah, it's really heavy stuff. And I think a lot of our listeners probably remember the basics of the case. But just to kind of set the stage, Vanessa Guillen was a 20-year-old U.S. Army specialist stationed at Fort Hood. And, Fort Hood itself has a bit of a history.
Oh, yeah, a lot of a history.
Yeah, unfortunately. But Vanessa disappeared from the base on April 22, 2020.
Right.
And her disappearance set off, just this massive search. And her family was so incredible, just tireless advocates for her. And they really brought national attention to the case. And, the details of this case are really disturbing. But I think it's important to talk about them to really understand what happened.
Absolutely. It's the kind of case right from the start. Just the way that it unfolded, it just immediately grabs your attention, when someone vanishes from their workplace. And in this case, it was the armory on base, right? And they leave all their belongings behind, like her phone, her wallet, her keys.
Right. Everything.
It just, it sends a chill down your spine because it's like, okay, this isn't someone just, walking away.
Yeah, it's not a case of like, oh, she just decided to leave and start a new life. She literally vanished into thin air.
Right.
And they found no trace of her for months. So I guess I'm curious about those early days of the investigation. What were you thinking when you first heard about this case and, saw those details about her belongings being left behind?
Well, my immediate thought was that something was terribly wrong. And that's often the case when you see a situation where personal belongings are left untouched. It usually suggests a forced disappearance or a scenario where the perpetrator is trying to make it look like the person left voluntarily to throw off investigators.
Oh, wow. So they're already thinking about like staging and covering their tracks at that point.
Exactly. It's a way to buy themselves time and potentially mislead the investigation.
So months go by and still no sign of Vanessa. And then, the news hits that her remains have been found. And it's devastating the way she was murdered with a hammer right there in the armory.
Yeah.
So how do you even begin to process something like that?
It's just brutal. There's no other way to put it. And, the fact that she was murdered in the armory, her workplace, it just adds another layer of, fear and just the violation of that space.
Right. And like you were saying before about the perpetrator potentially trying to cover their tracks, it came out later that they had actually tried to dismember her body and bury it.
Right. They had actually tried to dismember and bury the body in shallow graves near the Leon River. And that really speaks to premeditation and a desperate attempt to conceal the truth.
They knew what they were doing, and they were trying to get away with it. And it was actually that attempted cover-up that led investigators to Specialist Aaron Robinson, who was also a soldier at Fort Hood.
Right. Robinson was identified as the prime suspect in the case.
And what can you tell us about his involvement? What do we know about what happened?
Well, what we know is that Robinson's actions after the murder painted a very damning picture. He fled the base when confronted by law enforcement, and tragically, he took his own life.
Wow.
Which, robbed Vanessa's family of the chance to see him face justice in court.
Right. It's just another layer of tragedy on top of everything else. And it came out that Robinson didn't act alone, right? His girlfriend, Cecily Aguilar, was charged with helping him dispose of Vanessa's body.
Yes, that's right. Aguilar was charged with helping Robinson dispose of the body, and she actually confessed to her role in the crime.
Wow. So her confession really kind of solidified that whole picture of what happened and how they tried to cover it up. But I think one of the things that really stuck with me about this case was the suspected motive master. Investigators believed that Vanessa was planning to report Robinson for sexual harassment.
Yeah.
So she was potentially silenced for trying to speak up against harassment.
Yeah, and that just adds, this whole other devastating layer to this case because, we're not just talking about a horrific act of violence, but we're potentially looking at a case where a young woman who is serving her country was silenced for trying to do what's right, for trying to report harassment. And I think that's something that really resonated with a lot of people.
Right, and it kind of brings up the whole issue of systems that are in place to protect vulnerable individuals, particularly in the military, where there's this very strict hierarchy.
Absolutely. And I think that's where Vanessa's story transcends being just a single tragedy. It really ignited a national outcry and demands for reform within the military and how they handle these kinds of cases.
Right. And that's where the I Am Vanessa Guillen Act comes in.
Exactly.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So the I Am Vanessa Guillen Act was passed in 2021, and it represents a really significant step toward addressing some of the systemic issues that were highlighted by this case. It overhauls how the military handles sexual harassment and assault allegations, and it takes the reporting of these crimes outside of the chain of command.
Oh, okay, so that's a huge change.
Yeah, it creates a more independent process and hopefully makes it safer for service members to come forward without fear of retaliation.
It's tragic that it took such a horrific event to bring about this change.
Yeah, absolutely.
But Vanessa's legacy lives on in that fight for justice.
Absolutely.
And so I think, this case really serves as a stark reminder for all of us that we need to believe survivors, and we need to advocate for systemic change, and we need to demand accountability, because it goes beyond just this single tragedy. It's about preventing future ones.
I couldn't agree more.
This has been a really heavy topic, and I appreciate you coming on and sharing your insights with us.
Thank you for having me.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us for this deep dive. I think it's so important that we continue to have these conversations and keep pushing for change.
Absolutely.
All right, we'll see you next time.
Sounds good.